Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we continue with the story of Bizhan and Manizheh. Manizheh heard about the caravan from Iran, and she hurried to Persian city. Unveiled and weeping, Rostam's daughter came before Rostam, wiping her tears from her face and sleeve, and she said, "I wish you life and long prosperity. May God protect you from adversity. May heaven prosper all you say and do. May evil glances never injure you. Whatever purposes you hope to gain, may all your efforts never bring you pain. May wisdom be your guide. May fortune bless Iran with prosperous days and happiness. What news have you? What tidings can you bring of Persia's champions or of their king? Haven't they heard Bizhan is here? Don't they desire to help their friend in any way? Will he be left by Jiv, by all his kin, to perish in the pit he suffers in? Fetters weigh down his legs, his arm and hands. There are fixed to stakes by heavy iron bands. He hangs in chain, blood stains his clothes. I weep to hear his groans, and never rest or sleep." Rostam was afraid when he heard her, and he burst out as if in rage, pushing her toward the street. "Get away from me. I don't know any kings. I know nothing about Jiv or that family. Your words mean nothing to me." Manizheh stared at Rostam and sobbed pitifully. She said, "You're a great and wise man, and your cold words don't suit you. Say nothing if you wish, but don't drive me from you, for my sufferings have worn away my life. Is this the way Persians treat people? Do they deny news to the poor and the wretched?" Rostam said, "What's the matter with you, woman? Has Ahriman told you the world's coming to an end? You disrupted my trade, and that's why I was angry with you. Don't let what I said upset you. I was worried about selling my goods. As for the king, I don't live in the city where he does, and I know nothing about Jiv or his clan. I've never been to the area where they live." Quickly, he had whatever food was available set in front of the poor woman, and then he questioned her as to what made her so unhappy, why she was so interested in the Persian king and nobility, and why she kept her eye on the road from Iran for the whole time. Manizheh said, "And why should you want to know what my sorrows and misfortunes are? I left the pit with my heart filled with anguish and ran to you, thinking you were a free and noble man. And you yelled at me like a warrior attacking an enemy. Have you no fear of God in you? I am Manizheh, Rostam's daughter. Once the sun never saw me unveiled. But now my face is sallow with grief. My eyes are filled with bloody tears, and I wander from house to house seeking charity. I beg for bread. This is the fate God has visited upon me. Has any life ever been more wretched than mine? May God have mercy on me. And poor Bizhan in the pit never sees the sun or moon, but hangs in chains and fetters, begging God for death. His pain adds to my pain, and I have wept so much that my eyes can weep no more. But if you go to Iran again and hear news of Gouda's, or if you see Jiv at K. Khosrow's court, or the hero Rostam, tell them that Bizhan lies here in deep distress, and if they delay, it will be too late. If they wish to see him alive, they should hurry, for he is crushed between the stone above him and the iron that binds him." Rostam wept tears of sympathy and said to her, "Dear lovely child, why don't you have the nobles of your country intercede for you and with your father? Surely he would forgive you and feel remorse for what's happened." Then he ordered his cooks to bring Manizheh all kinds of food, and especially he told them to prepare a roasted chicken, folded round with soft bread. When they brought this, Rostam dexterously slipped a ring into it and gave it to Manizheh, saying, "Take this to the pit, and look after that poor prisoner who languishes there." Manizheh hurried back to the pit with the food wrapped in a cloth and clutched against her breast. She passed it down to Bizhan just as she'd received it. Bizhan peered at it in astonishment and called to her, "Dearest Manizheh, you suffered so much on my behalf. Where did you get this food you're in such a hurry to give me?" She said, "From a Persian merchant who's come with a caravan of goods to Tehran. He seems like someone who's passed through many trials, a noble and splendid man. He had a great many jewels with him, and has his shop set up in a big warehouse in front of Piran's castle. He gave me the food wrapped in cloth, and told me to bring it to you, and said I could return for more later." Hopeful and apprehensive, Bizhan began to open the bread, and as he did, out came the hidden ring. He peered at the stone in it, and made out a name, and then he laughed in triumph and astonishment. It was a Turkish seal with the word Rostam engraved on it, with a steel point as fine as a hair. Bizhan saw that the tree of loyalty had borne fruit. He knew that the key to his release from his suffering was at hand. He laughed long and loud, and when Manizheh heard him laughing, chained in the darkness as he was, she was alarmed and feared that he had gone mad. She called down to him, "How can you laugh when you can't tell night from day? What do you know that I don't? Tell me, has good fortune suddenly shown her face?" Bizhan replied, "I'm hopeful that fate will finally free me from this pit. If you can swear to keep faith with me, I'll tell you the whole tale from beginning to end, but only if you swear yourself to secrecy, because a man can sew up a woman's mouth to prevent idle talk, and still she'll find some way to loose her tongue." Manizheh wept and wailed, "How wretched my fate is! Alas for the days of my youth, for my broken heart and my weeping eyes! I've given Bizhan my body, my soul, my wealth. Now he cannot trust me. My treasury and my jewel crown were plundered. My father cast me out, unveiled and humiliated me before his court. And now that Bizhan has seen hope, he leaves me in despair. The world is dark to me. My eyes see nothing. Bizhan hides his thoughts from me, and only God knows all things." Bizhan replied, "What you say is true. You lost everything for my sake. I should not have said what I said. My kindest friend, my dearest wife, you have to guide me now. The agony I've suffered has turned my brains. Know that the man selling jewels, whose cook gave you the food you brought, has come to Tehran looking for me. That's the only reason he's selling jewels. God has taken pity on me, and I shall see the broad earth once again. This jeweler, who saved me from my long agony, and you from your grief and beggary on my behalf. Go to him once again, and say to him in secret, 'Great hero of the world's kings, tender-hearted and remorseful, tell me if you are Raksh's lord.'" Manizheh hurried to Rostam like the wind, and spoke as Bizhan had instructed her. When Rostam saw her running like this and heard what she had to say, he knew that Bizhan had entrusted her with their secret. His heart melted, and he said, "May God never withdraw his kindness from you, my lovely child. Tell him, yes, I am Raksh's lord, sent by God to save you. I have traveled the long road from Zabul to Iran, and from Iran to Tehran for your sake. Tell him, but let no one else know of this. In the darkest night, listen for the least sound. Spend the next day gathering firewood in the forest, and when night comes, light a huge bonfire." Overjoyed at his words, and freed from all sorrow, Manizheh hurried back to the pit where Bizhan lay bound. She said, "I gave the great lord your message, and he confirmed that he was the man you said he was. He told me to wipe away my tears, and to say to you that he had come here like a leopard to find you. And now that he has done so, you would soon enough see the sword's work. He will tear up the ground and throw the stone that covers you to the stars. He told me that when the sun releases its grip on the world and night comes, I am to build a huge fire so that the stone and the pit's whereabouts shine like the daytime, and he will be able to see the glow as it guides him to you." Bizhan said, "Light the fire that will deliver us both from darkness." So she prayed to God, saying, "Pure, splendid, and just, release me from all sorrows, and strike down my enemies with your arrows. Give me justice, for you know the pains and grief I have suffered. Allow me to see my native country again, and to smash against the stone my evil star." Then he addressed Manizheh, "And you, who suffered long and patiently, who've given heart and soul and wealth for me, who thought that undergone for me distress was but another name for happiness, who cast aside your kin, your noble name, your parents, crown and land, to share my shame. If in my youth I find I'm free again, delivered from this dragon and this pain, I'll bow before you like a man whose days are passed before his God in prayer and praise. Prompt as a slave who waits before his Lord, I'll find you, for you are a glorious reward. Manizheh set about gathering firewood, going from branch to branch like a bird, her eyes fixed on the sun to mark when it would drop behind the mountains. And when she saw the sun disappear and night draw in skirts over the mountain slopes, at that moment, when the world finds peace and all that is visible fades from sight because night's army has veiled sunlight in darkness, Manizheh's heart pounded like a brass drum as she listened for the iron hooves of Raksh. For his part, Rostam put on his armor and prayed to the god of the sun and the moon, saying, "May the eyes of the evil be blinded. Give me strength to complete the business of Bizhan." He ordered his warriors to prepare for battle. Poplar wood saddles were placed on their mounts, and they made ready to fight. They set out toward the distant glow and traveled expeditiously. When they reached the great stone of the Akvandiv and the pit of sorrow and the grief, Rostam said to his 7 companions, "You'll have to dismount and find some way to remove that stone from the mouth of the pit." But no matter how hard the warriors struggled, they could not shift the stone. When Rostam saw how they sweated to no avail, he too dismounted and hitched up his skirts about his waist, praying to God for strength. He set his hands to the stone, and he lifted it with a lion's power. He flung it into the forest, and the ground shuddered as the stone landed. He peered into the pit and sighed in sympathy, addressed Bizhan. "How did such a misfortune happen to you? Your portion from the world was to have been one of delight. How is it that the goblet you took from her hands was filled with poison?" Bizhan answered from the darkness, "Your journey must have been long and hard. When I heard your war cry, all the world's poison turned to sweetness for me. You see how I have lived, with the iron as my earth and the stone as my sky. I've suffered so much pain and grief that I gave up all hope of the world." Rostam replied, "The shining keeper of the world has had mercy on your soul, and now I have one request to ask of you, that you grant me Gorgon's life, and that you drive from your heart all thoughts of hatred for him." Bizhan said, "What do you know of my experience with this companion of mine, my lion-hearted friend? What do you know of how Gorgon treated me? If I ever set eyes on him again, my vengeance will be like God's last judgment." Rostam said, "If you persist in this hatred and refuse to listen to what I have to say, I shall leave you chained here in this pit. I shall mount Raksh and return whence I came." When he heard Rostam's words, a cry of grief rose from the pit, and Bizhan said, "I am the most wretched of our clan's heroes. The evil that came to me was from Gorgon, and now I must suffer this too? But I accept, and I drive all thoughts of hatred from my heart." Rostam lowered his lariat into the pit and brought Bizhan out of its depths, wasted away with pain and suffering, his legs still shackled, his head uncovered, his hair and nails grown long, all his body caked with blood where the chains had eaten into his flesh. Rostam gave a great cry when he saw how weighed down with iron, and set about breaking the fetters and shackles. They made their way with Bizhan on one side of Rostam, and the woman who had succored him on the other. The 2 young people recounted their sufferings to the hero, who had Bizhan's head washed and fresh clothes brought for him. Then Gorgon came forward and sank to the ground, striking his face against the dust. He asked pardon for his evil acts and for the foolish things he had said. Bizhan's heart forgave him, and he forgot all thoughts of punishment. The camels were loaded with their goods. Rostam put on his armor once more, and the Persian warriors mounted with drawn swords and maces at the ready. Oshkosh, who was a wary fighter, always on the lookout for whatever might harm the army, led off the baggage train. Rostam said to Bizhan, "You and Manizheh should go with Oshkosh. Afrsab will be so enraged that we cannot rest tonight. I'm going to play a trick on him within his own walls, and his whole country will laugh at him tomorrow. But Bizhan answers was, if I'm the one who's being avenged, I should be the head of this expedition. Rostam and the 7 warriors left the baggage train in Oshkosh's capable hands and set out, letting their reins hang slack on their saddles and drawing their swords. They arrived at Afrazab's palace at the time when men turned to drunkenness, rest, and sleep. They attacked, and confusion reigned. Swords glittered, arrows poured down, heads fell severed from bodies, mouths were clogged with dust. Rostam stood in the portico of Afrazab's palace and yelled, "So you sleep, do you? You and your valiant warriors? You slept in state while Bizhan was in the pit, but did you dream of an iron wall confronting you? I am Rostam, the son of Zal. Now is no time for sleep in soft beds. I have smashed your chains and removed the stone you set as Bizhan's keeper. He is free of his fetters, and rightly so, since this was no way to treat a son-in-law. Were Siavash's sufferings and the war that came from them not enough for you? You have no right to seek Bizhan's life, but I see your heart stupefied and your minds asleep." And Bizhan cried out, "Misbegotten, evil-minded Turk, think how you dealt with me when you were on your throne, and I stood chained before you then, when was bound motionless as a stone. You were savage as a leopard, but now I walk freely on the face of the earth, and the ferocious lion slinks off." Afrazab struggled with his clothes and called out, "Are all my warriors asleep? Any man who wants jewels and a crown, block these enemies' advances." Cries and confused noises of combat resounded on all sides, and blood streamed beneath Afrazab's door. Every Turanian warrior who ventured forward was killed, and finally Afrazab fled from his palace. Rostam entered the building and distributed among his men its cloths and carpets, the noble horses with their poplar wood saddles covered with leopard skins and jewels, and the king's womenfolk who took the Persian heroes by the hand. They left the palace and packed up their plunder, having no intention of staying any longer in Tehran. Because of the baggage they carried in to avoid a bitter outcome from their expedition, they urged the horses forward as fast as they could. Rostam became so exhausted by their haste that even the weight of his helmet was a trouble to him, and his companions and their horses were so weak they had hardly a pulse left in their arteries. Rostam sent a messenger to the forces he had left when he crossed into Tehran, saying, "Draw your swords from their scabbards. I am certain that the earth will soon be black with an army's hoofs. Afrazab will muster an army of vengeance and follow us here. Their lances will darken the sunlight." At last, the returning group reached the waiting army. They made themselves ready for battle, their lances sharpened, their reins at the ready. A lookout saw horsemen approaching from Tehran, and Rostam went to Manizheh in her tent and said, "If the wine has been spilt, its scent still lingers. If our pleasures are past, the memory of them is still ours. But this is the way of the world, giving us now sweetness and pleasure, now bitterness and pain." As soon as the sun rose above the mountaintops, Tehran's warriors had begun to prepare for their onslaught. The town was filled with a deafening clamor. Horsemen mustered in their ranks before Afrazab's palace. Tehran's nobles bowed their heads to the ground before him, and all were eager to exact vengeance from Iran. They felt that the time had passed for words. A remedy had to be found. Since what Bizhan had done had disgraced their king forever, the Iranians do not call us men, they said. They say we are women dressed as warriors. Like a leopard, Afrazab strode forward and gave the signal for a war. He ordered Piran to take the war drums strapped on the elephants, saying, "These Persians will make fun of us no more." Brass trumpets, bugles, and Indian chimes rang out before the palace. Tehran was in an uproar as the army set out for the Persian border, and the whole earth seemed like a moving ocean. A lookout saw the earth heaving like the sea and ran to Rostam. "Prepare to fight. The world has turned black from the dust flung up by their horsemen." But Rostam replied, There's no cause for fear. This is what they'll come if they fight with us. Leaving the baggage with Manizheh, he donned his armor and came out to inspect his troops, roaring like a lion. What use is a fox when it's caught in a lion's claws? Then he addressed his men. The day of battle's come, my noble lords. Where are your iron-piercing spears, your swords? Now is the time to show your bravery and turn our vengeance into victory. The trumpets blared, and Rostam mounted Raksh. He led his men down from the mountainside as the enemy were passing through a defile to the plains. The two sides ranged themselves behind walls of iron-dad warriors. On the Persian side, Ashkush and Gostaham and their horsemen made up the right flank. The left was commanded by Farid and Zanga, while Rostam himself and Bizhan were in the center. Behind them towered Mount Bizatan, and before them was a wall of swords. When Afrasab saw the enemy forces were led by Rostam, he put on his armor uneasily and ordered his men to hold back. He had them form defensive ranks. The air darkened. The ground disappeared. He entrusted his left flank to Piran and the right to Human. The center was held by Garsavaz and Shaddad, while he himself kept an eye on all parts of the line. Like a massive mountain, Rostam rode up and down between the different parts of his warriors. You miserable, wretched Turk, your shame, your throne, your warriors, your noble name. Your heart's not in the fight. How many men you've mustered in your army's ranks, but when the battle's joined at last and I attack, I'll see no more your returning back. And did my father never say to you the ancient proverb that are always true? A herd of milling asses cannot fight against a single lion's savage might. All heaven's stars will never equal one. In glory and in radiance the sun. Words won't give courage to a fox. No laws can make an ass develop lion's claws. Don't be a fool. If you want to save your sovereignty, don't act as if you're brave. If you attack this time in all this plain, you won't escape alive from me again. Excuse me. When the Turkish king heard these words, he trembled, heaved a bitter sigh, and cried out in fury, "Warriors of Tehran! Is this a battlefield or a banqueting hall?" When they heard their commander's voice, a great shout up from the Turanian ranks. Dust rose into the sky, obscuring the sun. War drums were fastened on elephants. Horns and trumpets sounded, and the line of armored warriors made a solid iron wall. The plain and mountain slopes re-echoed with cries from men on both sides in the dusty air. The glitter of swords flashed as if the world's end had come, and blows from steel maces rained down on armor and helmets like hail. Rostam's banner, with its dragon device, seemed to eclipse the sun. Wherever he rode, severed heads fell to the ground. With his ox-headed mace, he was like a maddened dromedary that has slipped its tether, and from the center of the army he scattered his enemies like a wolf. On the right flank, Oshkosh pressed on like the wind, eager for combat with Garsavaz. On the left, Gorgian, Farhad, and Roham pushed back the Turkish warriors, and in the center, Bizhan went triumphantly forward as if the battle were a celebratory feast. Warriors' heads fell like leaves from a tree, and the battlefield, it became a river of blood in which the Turkish banners lay overturned and abandoned. When Afrasab saw the day was lost and that his brave warriors had been slain, he threw away his Indian sword and mounted a fresh horse. He separated himself from the Turkish army and rode towards Tehran, having achieved nothing by his attempt to ambush the Persians. Rostam sped after him, raining arrows and blows on the intervening Turks. Like a fire-breathing dragon, he followed him for 2 parasangs, but finally returned to camp, where 1,000 Turkish prisoners were waiting. There he distributed to the army the wealth his men had captured, loaded up the elephant train and baggage, and set out in triumph to Khosrow. When news reached the king that the lion was returning victorious, that Bizhan had been released from the prison where he'd been held, that the army of Turan had been smashed, and all their hopes had come to naught, he prayed to God for joy, striking his face and forehead against the dust. Gudaz and Jiv hurried to Khosrow. The noise of the approaching armies, war drums, and trumpets could be heard. Then the ground in front of the king's palace was darkened by horses' hoofs. The clamor of trumpets and horns resounded throughout the city. The banners of Gudaz and Jiv were raised. Chained leopards and lions were led out on one side, and on the other were mounted warriors. In this fashion, as the king had commanded, the army went out to greet the returning victors. When Rostam emerged from the approaching group, Gudaz and Jiv dismounted, and all the Persian nobility followed suit. Rostam, too, dismounted, and greeted those who had come to welcome him. Gudaz and Jiv addressed him. "Great commander, may God hold you forever in his keeping. May the sun and moon turn as you would wish. May the heavens never tire of you. You have made us your slaves, for through you we have found our lost son. It is you who has delivered us from pain and sorrow, and all Persians long to serve you." The nobles remounted and processed toward the king. When they were close to the city, Khosrow came out and welcomed Rostam as the guardian of all heroes. Rostam saw the king himself was coming to greet him, and he dismounted once more, saying to him, as he humbled himself before the king, Khosrow embraced him and said, "You are a root stock of manliness, and a man of virtues. Your deeds shine like the sun, for their goodness is everywhere." Quickly Rostam took Bizhan by the hand and handed him over to his father and his king. Then he brought the 1,000 Turanian prisoners bound before the king, and Khosrow called down heaven's blessings on him, praising Zal, who had such a son, and Zavol, that had nurtured such a hero. Next the king addressed Jiv. "The hidden purposes of God have looked kindly on you. Through Rostam he has restored your son to you." Jiv replied, "May you live happily and forever, and may Rostam's luck remain ever fresh and green, and may Zal rejoice in his son." Khosrow gave a great feast for his nobles, after which the company went to a splendid hall, where they piled with wine and entertained by richly dressed musicians whose cheeks blushed like rich brocade, and who accompanied their songs with the bewitching sounds of harps. There were golden trays heaped with musk, and to the front of the hall was an artificial pool filled with rosewater in his glory. The king seemed like a cypress topped by a full moon, and when the nobles left his palace, every one of them was drunk. At dawn, Rostam returned to the court, prompt to serve his prince, and with not a care in his heart. He asked for permission to return home. Khosrow discussed this with him for a while. He ordered his chamberlains to bring him in a suit of clothes sewn with jewels, a cloak and crown, a goblet filled with royal gems, 100 saddle horses, 100 laden mules, 100 servant girls, 100 serving youths. All these he gave to Rostam, who kissed the ground in thanks. The hero then placed the crown on his head, girt himself in the cloak and belt, and made farewells to the king, and took the road to Sistan. This with his noble companions, who had seen so much sorrow and joy and suffering at his sides, were also given presents, and they, too, left the king's palace in good spirits. When the king had said farewell to his champions, he settled contentedly on his throne, and summoned Bizhan. He asked him about the pains and sorrows he had endured, their narrow pit where he'd languished, and the woman who had ministered to him. Bizhan talked at length, and as the king listened, he was moved to pity, both for him and for the torments Afrasab's poor daughter had endured. He had 100 sets of clothes of cloth of gold worked with jewels brought in, as well as a crown, 10 purses of gold coins, slaves, carpets, and all manners of goods, and said to Bizhan, "Take these to your grieving Turkish friend. Speak gently to her. See you don't make her sufferings worse. Think what she has gone through for your sake. Live your life in happiness with her now, and consider the turnings of fate, who lifts one of the high heavens so that he knows nothing of grief or pain, and then throws him weeping beneath the dust. It is a fearful, terrible to think on this, and while one is brought up with luxury and caresses, and is thrown bewildered and despairing into the dark pit, another is lifted from the pit and raised to a throne where a jeweled crown is placed on his head. The world has no shame in doing this. It is prompt to hand out both pleasure and pain, and has no need to us and our doings. Such is the way of the world that guides us both good and evil. Now, you should never need for wealth, and I wish you a heart free from all sorrow. The war between Iran and Turan continued, but Turan's forces were inexorably driven back and defeated by Khosrow's army. In one encounter, Piran was killed by Gudaz, and his death was lamented by both Khosrow and Rostam, who remembered him as a noble, conciliatory counselor who had protected fugitive Persians in Turan and tried, when possible, to make peace between two people. Piran died stoically, accepting his fate, but when Afrazad was finally captured and brought before Khosrow, he pleaded for his life and was ignominiously executed. Still alive, but living in retirement and far from the center of events, Khosrow felt that, with the death of his lifelong enemy, his life's last mission had been accomplished. And here we end our tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends.